And it is officially starting time. Between 1997 and 2002, I served on the faculty of the American Management Association, and every year the AMA publishes a book of lists, and it's a book of lists of almost any topic you can imagine under the sun. You've seen these in your doctor's offices, dentist waiting rooms, and one of the fun lists that we as faculty were eager to see each year was what made it onto the list of the top 10 fears. These are the top 10 fears and phobias that leave many people trembling in their seats and shaking in their shoes. These are things that scare us. These are things that make us very nervous. Now, according to the most recently released list, any wild guesses as to what the #1 fear is this year? Because it hasn't changed from last year or the year before that or the past several years for that matter. In fact, to put it into context, the fear of public speaking came in at #1. I don't think any of us is surprised by that, but in comparison with the other fears, this year, fear #4 was the fear of snakes. #3 was the fear of spiders. #2 was the fear of heights. And the #1 fear was indeed the fear of having to stand up and speak in public. And it was the #1 fear for about 20 years. 5 years ago, however, it was not. Messed me up for a year, though, because you know what the #1 fear was that year? The fear of dentists that you see on the screen. And I can't travel and teach no panic dentistry skills, so I was out of luck for about a year. But the fear of public speaking is back at that #1 spot. And that's why I believe it's very important for all of us today to distinguish between public speaking and presentation skills. You may not all necessarily consider yourselves to be public speakers, but you are all professional presenters. And let that sink in, because in our lines of work, in most cases, every day is a presentation. As I tell my corporate clients, every day is an interview. Every day is a presentation, and every presentation counts, whether it's in an informal daily setting with coworkers or team members or a more formal gathering. Maybe for you it's a board meeting, a meeting of your partners, or you may be invited to present your area of expertise at a professional conference in your industry or association. I know today we have quite a few corporate trainers and learning and development specialists and instructors participating, but regardless of your job title, every day is a presentation. And in the more traditional definition of presentation skills, there are 3 components to any workplace or business presentation, and everything I share with you for the next 50 minutes will come directly from the book you see on the screen, The No Panic Plan for Presenters. An A to Z checklist for speaking confidently and compellingly anywhere, anytime. And in a 60-minute webinar, we would have to rush through the entire A to Z notes. So rather than do that, we're going to highlight the most practical and tactical presentation best practices. Rather than glossing over many topics at a surface level, we are going to focus on some of the top tier ideas, the micro actions that will make us more memorable as presenters or meeting facilitators. What are some of the ideas that will help your message stand out from the rest of the crowd? We don't want to settle for mediocrity, even in informal meetings that pop up in our offices. And that is why you received a PDF to download prior to our time together today. It's titled ABC's Download, and when you open it, the first page is titled Hair on Fire Presentation Skills. Those are your notes pages for our time together. You see, I believe even webinars should be interactive these days. You don't want to just sit and listen passively for 60 minutes, especially with a topic such as presentation skills. We'll retain more by participating and by even jumping in and writing your answers and notes. And some of you may have printed out that A to Z checklist prior to logging on, and you can write your notes directly on the notes pages. I do hope you'll find this A to Z checklist to be a go-to resource you can use as a ready reference beyond our time together, because I designed it to be an easy-to-read recap of what we discussed. And as I said, You can jot your notes today in the margins. You heard me mention there are 3 components to a well-crafted workplace meeting or presentation. Here's the first, your message, your content. And how do you organize that logically with a strong opening and even stronger closing, and how to stay on point? Because we have all been in meetings and presentations where the presenter didn't seem to stay on point, didn't value the audience's time, did not seem to plan his or her remarks well, and then ended up chasing what we call rabbits around the room, getting pulled off topic and never finding the way back. And that is why, under today's promises for our message, here's what we'll expect to tackle. We're going to look at the 3-minute first impression, which you absolutely must do in meetings in the first 180 seconds to build rapport and credibility with the people you meet. We're going to look at how to banish boring presentation openings by figuring out what every other presenter does and not doing the same thing. And then we're also going to look at the 3 must-haves in a presentation audience to hook your audience. Under this same topic, we'll look at how to close, how to avoid fizzling out at the end by closing with conviction every time, including how to handle Q&A. To accomplish all of this efficiently within the confines of a webinar format, I have found from experience the best way to effectively tackle these topics is through case studies. Tasha Mack will be case study number 1. She's our case study for message. Tasha Mack is a compliance officer at a large CPA firm, and while she's been with the firm for several years, she has just recently been tasked with presenting educational sessions to employees. This is the photo she sent me after her first session, where she delivered a mandatory ethics and compliance session. And by the way, I am using her photograph and her story with permission. Tasha Mack is also in grad school right now, where she and her cohort must make numerous presentations for grades. So Tasha is a talented woman with a vivacious personality and the gift of gab. However, that doesn't make you a naturally good presenter. Sometimes that can work against you. She's a natural storyteller, but sometimes you can have too much of a good thing. Now, not that Tasha Mack was guilty of this, but there are some presenters who get so caught up in telling stories that they never make a point. We call them maybe fluffy speakers. They're usually the ones who don't watch the clock, go over their allotted time, and they're so good at speaking and presenting, and they really are enjoyable to listen to, but sometimes they think they can just wing it. No, we should never wing it. Our audience deserves our prep time. You may be a subject matter expert and know your topic backwards, forward, and upside down standing on your head, but we need to have a plan and at least a skeleton format, and that is what we did with Tasha Mack, and I will show you how under our message module. So we have message. Our second component of the 3 components is our delivery of that message, which, if you have ever experienced an excruciatingly slow and painful death by PowerPoint, you know there's some bad slides out there, and they are reproducing rapidly. So under today's promises for delivery, we're going to look at the secret to eliminating nervous habits and jitters, and especially all of that vocal garbage. We'll also look at a few bits of advice for uncluttering and overhauling our slides. So we've looked at message. Under delivery, our case study is Bob. He is case study number 2 for delivery. Bob is a salesman. He is in sporting goods sales, and he loves his job. Bob needed help with his vocal fillers. He told me he used them even in the drive-through windows at restaurants. When the fast food employee would come over the speaker and ask, "May I take your order, please?" Bob would say, "Yes, I'll have a cheeseburger," and you get the idea. It was such a bad habit he could not break it, and it bled over into his sales presentations with sporting goods buyers and university athletic directors. So we'll talk about Bob during the delivery module. Our third component is nonverbal know-how. And here's what we can expect to accomplish during that section of our webinar. We're going to look at tips for controlling your body language to communicate your message you want, and how to master eye contact, natural gesturing, and other nonverbal aspects. And our case study for nonverbals, Rhett. Now, Rhett's my favorite client, so to speak, because I am related to him. He is my rising 7th grade son. And if what I share with my corporate clients doesn't work for my own family, then I don't have any business teaching presentation skills, because it is never too early to begin teaching presentation best practices to your children so they don't dread public speaking in high school, so that they're good at it in college, they're good at it in their job interviews. From their earliest years, I have taught my 2 sons how to give adults 5 fingers and 2 eyes, to make good eye contact and look up when speaking with adults, and to offer a firm 5-finger handshake. Now, Rhett in the picture just needed some confidence last year. He's beginning to audition for middle school plays and make group presentations in some of his classes, and so I shared with him some tips to overcome bad nerves. And for all of us, throughout our time together, peppered in this presentation, you will see slides like this, labeled Top Tier Takeaways. This will give you some immediately actionable presentation best practices to incorporate beyond the basics we've all heard before. So let's go ahead and look at our first element, message. One of the promises we made in marketing this session is to talk about your 3-minute first impression, and I'm going to use the case study of Tasha Mack to launch this discussion. Because how many of you have ever heard you have 7 seconds to make an impression with someone? Well, that number is fairly true and reliable, and it's unfortunate, because what that means is we live in a very judgmental society where we meet someone and they look us up and down, and in about 7 seconds, they think they have us figured out based on the clothes we may be wearing, the way our hair looks, and the sound of our voice or our accent when we speak. Now, the good news for us as presenters and meeting facilitators is that we're given the benefit of a longer time frame than just 7 seconds. We're given 3 minutes or 180 seconds before audiences decide this meeting's going to be worth my time and I'm going to tune in, or before our audience decides this is going to be a total waste of time, how boring, this person is not organized, and they tune us out. So in other words, if it helps you to think about it this way, you have 3 minutes to either impress or depress your audience. Think about it. I submit to you there are several items you need to accomplish in your opening 3 minutes to be considered a top-tier presenter. And this is how I helped Tasha Mack engage her audience at the beginning. It begins with our audience. We want to recognize that we have 3 types of learners/listeners in our audience. We have our auditory audience members, our visual audience members, and our true hands-on kinesthetic audience members. With our auditory audience members, what we have to keep in mind with them is that they simply want us to tell them what we're here to tell them. So with our auditory folks, they're expecting us to tell them clearly and plainly up front what their expectation and objective should be. With our visual learners, they need more than a talking head. They need us to show them what we're there to talking about. And this is where a visual aid used very early can be helpful. This is where PowerPoint, if used well, is a positive. And then you have your true hands-on kinesthetic learners who are not going to feel part of the presentation unless you are intentionally letting them participate and do. Gone are the days of where our audiences expect a sage on the stage. They really want more of a guide on the side, even in formal presentations, more participatory. So my challenge to each of you, for those of you jotting notes down, is to make sure in your opening 3 minutes, you are incorporating some facet of the tell, show, do. Tell, show, do. Tell them what you're there to talk about. Use some visual aid to reinforce reinforce it and support it, and then get them involved early on in a way that's something other than a cheesy icebreaker. To support this idea even more, there are, for those of us, a three-pronged reminder. It's a well-known saying. You've probably all heard this before. In fact, I would ask that you help me fill in the blanks here. I blank and I forget. I blank and I remember. I blank and I understand. Words of wisdom for us as business presenters. Fill in the blanks. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. For those of you curious, the source of this quotation, Confucius, ancient Chinese proverb. I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. I do and I understand. May we be mindful of this advice as we plan our opening remarks. So your top tier takeaway here is, moving forward, and this is especially for those of you who may be invited to speak at a luncheon or lead a staff development or speak at some conference. For those of you who are presiding over more formal meetings, dissect your opening remarks to make sure you have included the elements of the auditory, visual, and kinesthetic learners in your audience. I color code my notes. I use blue for auditory, where maybe it's me explaining something. Red is visual if I have some prop or visual aid, or I'm moving to the next PowerPoint slide. I'll put a red box there to show me it's time to move to the next slide. And then green is my interactive. If I'm asking the audience a question, I'll write that question in green. Or if I have some sort of exercise, it's in green. And if I look at one of my pages, and I've been doing this for 22 years, and it's a lot of blue and very little green or red, that tells me this is too much of me talking and not enough about my audience. And I'm able to go back and revamp, think about how can I break this up with maybe a question or something engaging to keep them involved. Top tier takeaway. Another question we'll want to ask ourselves is, what is the most boring opening line in almost every meeting or business presentation you attend? What do you think? Usually it's something like, good morning, or good afternoon, or it's great to be here with you today, or thanks so much for being here. It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. The answer, the solution, is figure out what every other speaker says and then don't say the same thing. Let me give you a practical example of what we're talking about here. Recently, I was at an association meeting where 5 cities were named finalists and invited to pitch their location as the site for that association's next annual meeting. So in other words, this group is meeting in one city, and 5 other cities in the state want to be the venue for the next meeting. It brings great tourism dollars into an area when you have more than 1,000 people convene in your city, your hotel rooms, your restaurants. So all 5 of them were given 4 minutes in front of the audience to make a compelling case for why they should all want to come to that city the next year. And every single one of them got up there to say, good morning. It's great to be here today. Thank you so much for having us. All 5 speakers, and a couple of them came with dual speakers, stood up and said the same thing. And it was so disappointing because this could have been a very fun proposal pitch. They could have begun with a trivia contest about their city and given prizes for the people in the audience who knew the answers. That would have had blue, red, and green. They could have opened with a colorful montage of the sights and sounds of their city. They could have passed around a food item unique to the area. I would have voted for that one. They could have dressed up as a famous citizen from that location. What one of the cities was Elvis Presley's birthplace. They could have had fun with that. but not one of them wisely involved the people in the association in their presentation, nor did they capitalize on the presenter's 3-minute first impression. No one stood out from the other 4, and they were all competing for the same business. So the solution really is, don't get stuck in a speaking rut. Why do we want to do the same thing as everyone else? Why would we want to blend in with everyone else? And I don't want this to sound harsh, but it is downright lazy not to work on a good opening. It shows you haven't put any thought into the first words that come out of your mouth, and then you just end up falling back on good morning and thank you so much for having me here, and then stutter through a few fluffy remarks before actually getting to the main point of your presentation. And it's not that you don't be cordial and friendly. Those just shouldn't be your very first words. In fact, there is a communication theory known as the law of primacy and recency. And what it tells us is that people remember best what they hear first and last. So first and last are critical locations in our presentations. And that's why it's important to open with oomph. Now, you'll find more suggestions on this on the PDF I sent you under the letter O, which is open with oomph. But here are the 3 essential parts to the opening. Now, it looks like number 1 has been whited out on the screen, so I'll tell you what that is. It's not appearing on my screen, so I'm hoping you can see it. If not, I'll tell you what it is. But it's numbered 1, 2, 3 because you do these in order. You don't do 2 before you do 1. So number 1 is supposed to read, hook the audience first. Hook the audience first. And you'll get some ideas under how to hook the audience on that PDF I sent everyone. Do something to get them interested and involved. And we'll look at a few ideas there. Number 2, this is for the auditory people in the room, preview the purpose. They want to hear that you know what you're there to talk about. If it's an action presentation, be clear on the action expected. If the purpose is strictly informative, have a clear-cut sentence stating your main point. And then number 3 is to give them benefit. And listen, I used to think that people would know that you didn't really have to spell it out, but I have found it is a great idea to articulate the value. Make it about them. What's in it for them? Why should they spend this time in this meeting? What will they gain from it? And I have found it's very important to include that in your opening 3 minutes. So here are some of those open ideas. You'll see them on the screen. For instance, asking a provocative question or sharing some startling statistics or have some great visual aid you use to get everyone's interest right at the beginning. You might do some kind of interactive, but make sure it's not a cheesy, meaningless icebreaker. Those are some ideas for opening with oomph. In the same vein, it's important to open strong, but we need to close with an even stronger closing. Law of primacy and recency tells us people remember best what they hear first and last. So what about the last words that come out of our mouth? And really, for that matter, for some reason, we'll work really hard on our opening remarks, and we never think about the last words we're going to utter before we sit down or before we step off the stage. And so usually we just kind of meander into nothingness and wander off the platform. So closing with conviction is, again, it's easy as 1, 2, 3. Number 1 is your closing signal. This is when you actually say, in closing, or in conclusion, or to wrap things up. And test this out next time. Many times people are waiting to hear those words. And as soon as they hear you say, in conclusion, you'll notice every head in that audience will come back up. That there's a running joke in some churches that when the preacher says in closing, it actually means we still have a good 20 minutes left of material. So once you say you're closing, don't lie about it. If you're saying in conclusion, make sure you're wrapping things up. Now is not the time to introduce new information. If you've forgotten to say it earlier, once you've begun to close, it is not the time to add new information. Then number 2 is Q&A. And notice, everyone, it's not number 3. We do not end with Q&A. Again, we do not end with Q&A because that's a horrible way to close a presentation you've worked so hard on. So much can go wrong with Q&A. One, you can say, does anyone have any questions? And then nothing. Barely hear crickets in the room. And so the presenter will usually say, there's no such thing as a bad question. Are you sure you don't have any questions? And then the presenter is left to say, well, if not, I guess that's it then. Thank you. I mean, that's a horrible way to close a presentation. Or you could have someone during Q&A monopolize the show or state objections in the form of a question or ask you some random question that has nothing to do with the topic that you've been there to present. So as the speaker, yes, Q&A is very important, but you also want to make sure you come back and have the last word. And there it is at the bottom of the screen, the Big Bang. That's supposed to read the Big Bang. And what is the Big Bang? The Big Bang is some final closing remark that pulls everything together. I've listed a few on the screen for you. One great way to close a presentation after you've covered all the questions is to circle back to your opening promises and show that you've delivered what you promised. Or if it's a proposal presentation or an action-oriented presentation, to invoke your call to action and be very clear what the deadline or the target date is. To close with one final meaningful quotation or a challenge to your audience. And my very favorite closing is to say one good story, one client testimonial, one personal anecdote that you've been saving for the very end to drive it home. You know, I think the best business speakers we hear are sometimes the best storytellers. And if you can close with a good story, your audience will remember that story. And when they remember that story, they will remember the point the story supports. So that's a fantastic way to close a presentation, to wrap it up with a final story, example, testimonial. That, you see what you see on the screen there? That is the worst way. That should never be your last slide. Your last slide should always be your big bang. It is the main point you want people to be considering. The last slide should not have questions and a question mark. The last slide should be what you want people remembering when they walk out the door. And I hope for some of you that is an actionable idea. So your top tier takeaway here is to check your opening for the hook, the preview statement, and the benefit, and to check your closing for an obvious closing signal, an opportunity for questions, and a final big bang. Let's move on to delivery, everyone, and we're going to use Bob with this example. Now, the example here is the ums and the uhs and the vocal fillers, and I have found there is only one surefire cure for getting rid of the vocal garbage in your presentations. And just to be sure we're clear on this, yes, it's words such as and like, you know, but it's also weird noises that we make with our mouth when we speak, like the constant throat clear, that person who's always nervously clearing his or her throat, or the lip smacker, that person who kind of makes weird smacking noises while talking. It gets on our nerves, doesn't it? Or maybe it's not the ums and the uhs or the weird sounds. It could be favorite words and phrases that people use entirely too often when they're speaking. The ones that my live audience will tell me get on their nerves are words like, you know, when the speaker says like, you know, and you know, like, you know, or ending questions or comments with okay, like saying something, saying okay. And you may be thinking of some in your seats too. It's phrases like at the end of the day. Sure, you can say that once, but if you've said it 6 times, that's overkill. For me, it was the word particular. I had no idea. I was speaking to a group in Maine about 15 years ago, and a gentleman approached me at our first break and said, Miss Stanley, do you realize you've said the word particular 7 times already this morning? He went on to say that the word particular is what's considered to be one of the wasted words in the English language because it adds no value or meaning to what you're saying. It is just taking up space. It's a wasted word. Of course, this was 15 years ago. I was fairly new in this line of work, and I did not know how to respond to that. So I just said, well, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know what to say. But when I thought about it later, he was correct. Because I would say, now, in this particular example, or on this particular page, or on this particular slide, or in this particular situation, I did say it too much, and I had no idea until it made me so painfully aware of it, and I have not uttered that word since from the stage because he made me so aware of it. So the word particular was my favorite word that I used, and I had to learn to purge that from my vocabulary. I don't know what it is for you, but guess what? Other people do. They know what your favorite word is. It could be actually or basically. But here's the surefire cure of getting rid of it, because you know what doesn't get rid of it? Hiring someone like me. Hiring a speech coach is not going to help you eliminate the vocal garbage from your presentations. There's only one way to do it. Because I could tell you, you said 5 times, and you'll say it 6 times the next time you speak. The key to getting rid of the vocal fillers you'll see on the screen, and it is to video yourself prior to your presentation. I know. That is painful. I can't stand to video my presentations, but I still do it twice a year because I know I develop bad habits. And the secret to this is to set it aside for 48 hours. Why do you not want to watch it immediately? Because you're too familiar with it. If you have someone video it on a phone for you, and then you watch it, you'll be listening for any misspeaks. Rather, if you set it aside and watch it 48 hours later, you're picking it up with fresh eyes and a fresh mind, and you're not as familiar with it. Now, for that 48 hours time frame, you want to be prepared when you sit down and watch it. And so I use a notepad or a clipboard with some paper on it, and I'll draw a line down the center of it to break it into 2 columns. On the left-hand side, I label that what works. Because videoing yourself is not all about picking out every single thing you have done wrong during the presentation. It's about what works too. What you're doing well and need to continue doing. For instance, if you hear yourself say something, you think, yes, that sounded good and I need to remember to say it just like that. Just pause the recording and make a note of it. Or if you noticed the pause in a certain sentence worked or was well done, or there was something strong about one of your slides, again, make a note of that. And then on the right-hand side, label that one, opportunities for improvement. And you pause the tape anytime you see something you want to delete. Maybe you find that you're sticking your hands in your pockets the whole time. That is a nonverbal gesture we need to correct. Or that you're pacing back and forth, you're moving too much. Or maybe you sound really monotone, you're sounding like you're bored with yourself. Or maybe there's a certain word you continue to stumble over, and if you're having trouble saying it, make a note, you need to change it to another word because you're continuing to stumble over that one. And then in a box at the very bottom of that page, make a box. And every time you hear a vocal filler such as or put a tally mark. I worked with a gentleman running for public office in my state about 12 years ago. He was running for state senate. He had 138 ums and uhs in the first 2 minutes of his 5-minute stump speech. Now, I stopped counting after that. I recorded it. We videoed it. I gave it to him. He watched it. We got back together the next week. He went from 138 in the first 2 minutes to 0 in the entire 5-minute stump speech. Now, I was marveled by that dramatic a turnaround. I said, how did you? He said, Mandy, I watched that video recording and it made me sick. He said, I was physically ill when I heard how horrible I sounded. He said, I did not realize I sounded like that when I spoke with people. It was so bad. And so he quit cold turkey, so to speak. But that's the key. You have to disgust yourself enough to want to make that change. You have to hear it for yourself and hear how you sound when every third word is and. If it gets on your nerves, you know it's getting on other people's nerves. And recording yourself is the surefire cure for getting rid of those vocal fillers and favorite words. Top tier takeaway for sure. Video the dry run of your next presentation several days before the actual meeting or conference. Under delivery, we'll also quickly cover a few PowerPoint do's and don'ts. As a speaking coach, one of the complaints I hear most about is delivery, specifically PowerPoint. The presenter slideshow. In fact, I'll go so far as to say people don't really use PowerPoint correctly. As my friend Paul Verreter says, really we all want to live in a world with better PowerPoint. It would just help our meetings run a lot better, wouldn't it? So I'm going to refer to these slides as PowerPoint a lot, but I know some of you use other presentation software packages such as Keynote or PechaKucha or Prezi, and I may say PowerPoint, but the information pertains to all of the above. So here are the big three mistakes I see presenters make with their slides. The first are what we call data dumps. These are, well, how many of you work at places where the slides look like that? That should be 11 separate slides. So the key here is one message per slide. If you cram all of that on a slide, people aren't going to remember any of it. So one message per slide. Your top tier takeaway here is to assess your current slides for these three elements: limited text, supporting image, and a bold headline. If you do have to put text on slides, follow the 6x6 rule, which tells us if you are going to use bulleted lists, no more than 6 well-spaced bullets on a slide and no more than 6 words out beside each bullet point. We're not typing complete sentences. We write a few words and phrases that will remind us what we need to elaborate on and what we need to say about it. 6x6. One final thought with 6x6 is don't pop every bullet point up at the same time. This is where you can use animation. When the slide comes up, have just the headline. And then when you're ready to talk about the first bullet, pull it up, talk about it, but do not reveal the next one until you're ready to talk about that. You don't want your audience reading ahead of you, because what they'll do is they'll look at a slide, read through all the bullet points, and then tune you out, and you may not have even gotten past bullet number 1. Now, don't use silly, exaggerated transitions like words bopping onto the page or falling onto the screen like raindrops. Just use a simple appear, or maybe move in from one side. It doesn't need to be anything flashy, and whatever animation you choose, stick with that consistently during the presentation. A good slide is a 3-second slide. Your slides aren't your speaking script. You want to organize your presentation before you begin to design your slide deck. Or using weak, cheesy visuals. No more clip art and no more expected stock photos. We see these workers everywhere, and here they are again having such a good time at work. Find compelling visuals that will support your presentation. As far as size, for headings, no more than 44 points, but really no smaller than that either. And I think if you check, most PowerPoint templates default to that for the headings. And then no smaller than 32-point font for the body copy. You want to be able to read it. And you saw some of these other slides. Some people use 12-point font on their PowerPoint slides. Ultimately, though, it's all in our delivery. It's not PowerPoint's fault. It's our fault for not using it correctly or practicing with it. We all complain about death by PowerPoint, but it's the presenter or the trainer who hasn't practiced with the PowerPoint. It is all in our delivery. First bit of advice here is practice, practice, practice. I don't know anyone who's not busy these days, and I know projects get dumped in our laps all the time, but even the most gifted presenters and speakers shouldn't just try to wing it and expect to do well in a workplace presentation. Block out preparation time on your schedules and calendars. As Dr. John Medina says, if companies would have as little respect for business as they have for presentations, the majority would go bankrupt. According to the National Speakers Association, of which I am a member, a good 1-hour presentation demands at least 20 hours prep time and rehearsal. Wow. Here are a few other dumb moves we make with PowerPoint. That one. Don't be that guy. Standing in front of the screen. Now, in many cases, the projector will be mounted to the ceiling, and we don't have to worry about that as much anymore. But be very aware of it, because there will be meetings you have where that PowerPoint projector is wheeled in on a cart, and it's blocking you and the screen, and so you're going to have to walk back and forth in front of it. Make friends with the magic B button on your keyboard. If you need to cross in front of the projector, hit B, black out the screen, and when you get to the other side, turn it back on. We never want to cast shadow puppets onto the screen or stand in front of the screen. I maintain my ethics hours every year. I have to have a certain number as a certified speaking professional. And not long ago, they were offering a workshop in New Orleans, which is not far from where I live, and we could get 3 hours. So a couple of us drove to New Orleans, and we got there, and I don't know why we know how much she was getting paid, but the speaker they had hired that day was getting paid $80,000 for that presentation. Again, I have no idea how that got out or how we knew it. We certainly shouldn't have known that, but we knew that her paycheck for that 1 3-hour session was $80,000. And do you know, during the majority of the presentation, she stood in front of the screen just like that. And the reason it was so memorable to all of us is because she was wearing a pretty blue dress with this big blue jewel around her neck, this pendant around her neck, and every time the projector light hit it, it would bounce back off into the audience. I mean, we looked like a bunch of cats swatting at a ray of light, and I heard someone rather snarkily behind me say, you'd think for $80,000 she'd know not to stand in front of the projector. So again, this just leads to an amateur approach to presentations. We know better and can do better than this. We also don't want to turn around and read our slides to our audience. How many of you know people who turn around and just read for the audience what they can read for themselves? In fact, my speaking coach told me a long time ago, never read for people what they can read for themselves. If you're reading for them what they're reading on the screen, then one of you isn't necessary. This is a habit that is cured with practice. But a lot of executive presenters have the habit of turning around to look every time they switch to a new slide. We need to know our presentations well enough to know what comes next. We should not have to turn around and check. And a lot of times in large conferences, they'll provide you with what's called a confidence screen, so you don't have to turn around and check. But you also want to make sure you've practiced enough that you can forward through the slides and keep talking with seamless transitions because you've practiced and you know what comes next. Or this. I'm so guilty here. I'm the world's worst when it comes to putting my clicker down and then not remembering where I put it down. More than once I've had to stop to find where I set down my clicker. I've even asked the audience, did anyone see where I put my remote? Now, always have a home for the remote, and it's not always in your hands, because how many of you have been in a situation where the presenter accidentally forwarded slides and didn't realize it, and they turned around and they were totally lost? You can pocket dial slides as well, so be very careful with that. I always have a corner of the table where I set it, and that's where I'll know where it is. Finally, there's never a reason to say for your audience. Now, this slide may be kind of hard to read, or this may be a little difficult for you to see. No, that's the whole point of PowerPoint. If it's not readable, don't use it. PowerPoint slides are free. Make 2 of them. And to be the speaker who stands out among the crowd, check out Prezi at Prezi.com. It's a presentation platform that will amp up your presentation, and when used well, it really does give you a wow factor beyond PowerPoint. I can't use it in a webinar format, but you can definitely use it in your meetings and speeches. And don't save PowerPoint for when your presentation begins. Be using it as people come into the meeting room. Have a rolling montage of meaningful slides at 10-second intervals already playing as meeting attendees enter the room. It needs to be something pertaining to your conversation or your discussion you're about to have with them. But for instance, in my proofreading workshops, as people come in, I have 50 blooper slides going 10 minutes, and the audience is already laughing and looking at them before we even start. So it sets a very positive mood or vibe in the room. And you can use PowerPoint before you even say the first word. So we've looked at message, we've looked at nonverbals. In our final our delivery, in our final 7 minutes, we're going to look at our nonverbals, and we're going to use Rhett as our case study here. This, what you see on the screen, is one of the most misquoted and misused communication studies. So let me explain to you very quickly what this means to us as far as nonverbal know-how. Dr. Albert Mehrabian of UCLA back in the early 1980s conducted one of the most well-known communication studies. And in that study, the results determined that how your audience perceives or feels about your message, 55% of that comes from our nonverbals. How believable we are comes from our nonverbals. It's our body language. 38% of that is perceived through the tone of voice. If we say good morning, but we say it like this, good morning, they don't even believe it's a good morning. Only 7% of our meaning is perceived from the words we use, and yet that's what we sit down and script out first. So all this other nonverbal know-how needs to be practiced. So with eye contact, we want to use the quadrant approach. And what that means for all of us with the quadrant approach is that when you stand up in front of a group, either they're at a table, you can do this at a table, or in an audience, is break that room into quadrants. You have quadrant 1, quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. You see that at the bottom of your screen. So what you do is you pick someone in quadrant 1 and you talk to that person for 3 to 5 seconds. And then you look at someone in quadrant 2. One person is if he or she is the only person in the room and you talk to that person for 3 to 5 seconds. Then you pick someone in quadrant 3 and you talk to that person as if he or she is the only one in the room for 3 to 5 seconds, and then you pick someone in quadrant 4. This is what we call in the world of professional speaking how to work a room. You're making the people in the back so just as much a part of the presentation as the people who sit up front, and you're not forgetting your peripheries. We also want to talk about what not to do with our hands, and I have visuals to support this. When we stand up for speaking, we don't want to do what you see on these next few slides. This first one is called the fig leaf. It is very weak posturing in front of a group. When you stand up to speak, you do not want to clasp hands demurely in front of you. Nor do you want to hide your hands behind your back when you're speaking. This could imply to your audience that you're not being totally forthcoming. You're not telling them the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And if you keep your hands back there long enough, they might start thinking, what's he got back there? Another version of dishpan hands is your hands in your pockets. If you stick your hands in your pockets, you're going to find something annoying in your pockets. If you've heard people jingle change, that's called the banker. Some people find their keys in their pockets. Now, this jeweler is the person who stands up and fiddles with jewelry, maybe twists a ring on his or her finger, or plays with a bracelet, or fiddles with earrings. That is the surest sign that you are nervous in front of a group. Or standing up and crossing your arms like you know everything. This one is actually called the closed-minded professor, and it performs a barrier between you and your audience. This even is bad during one-on-one presentations, and we really don't realize how often we do it. Then you have the hands on your hips, which is called mothering. And as you can imagine, it's probably not appropriate nonverbal behavior with an audience of your peers. Finally, you want to lose the lectern. If at all possible, get rid of that barrier between you and your audience. If you can turn the lectern at a slight angle and stand to the side of it, that gets rid of that physical impediment from you and your audience. Some people use it as a crutch. They grab on with both hands and hang on for dear life. But whenever you can get rid of that big piece of furniture blocking you for connecting with your audience, you want to lose the lectern. In fact, if you see this picture of Tasha Mack here, here's what she told me about that. She says she feels her own confidence rise as she gets through the 3 aspects of her opening, and her comfort level is such that she gets away from that lectern back there, and she's able to come forward and really connect with the people in her audience. And I think that photo models that beautifully. So what's left to do with our hands? We use our hands for meaningful and natural gestures to complement what we're saying. And you will see more about this on the PDF under F, forget fidgeting, and G, gesture with grace and purpose. Finally, to help my son with his nervousness, I reminded them there really are two types of speakers, those who are nervous and those who are liars. So here are a few helpful bits of advice for tackling the nerves. Everyone has butterflies in their stomach. The only difference between a pro and an amateur is that pro has the butterflies in formation. Here's how we can do just that. Here's what I shared with my son, Red. First of all, remember, it is not about you. We get nervous because we make it all about us. What if I mess up? What if they don't like what I have to say? What if I'm just so bad? What if I'm not wearing the right thing? It's not about us. Think of your audience as friends. You're among friends. And think of your presentation as a gift that you are giving your audience. Make it all about them. Chances are they are there because you have something, you know something that they don't know about, and they're hoping you will explain it and walk it through them. Or the best advice, and I'm surprised how few people know to do this, but that nervous energy comes from pent-up adrenaline, and we have to let it out. If we don't, we're going to get on stage or stand up in front of that room, and our voice is going to be really shaky and quivery, or our hands will be shaking. And have you ever seen someone hold a piece of paper in his hands, and it starts shaking, and everyone focuses on the shaking paper, and they think, oh, bless his heart, he's so nervous. So no, here's what you want to do. Get rid of that energy before the meeting. Best example of this, a speaker friend of mine, Joel. I saw him at the conference center running up and down some stairs right before the presentation. I said, Joel, did you forget something? Do I need to run get something for you? You're about to go on stage. He said, no, Mandy, I do this every single time. I said, I get a little bit winded and out of breath, and it helps get that excess energy out of me so that I walk on stage, I'm a lot calmer, and everything just flows more smoothly. So he does some light exercise, some calisthenics before he goes on stage to get rid of that excess energy. Boy, that is some practical advice that really works. So, in the jungle of presentation skills, it really is the smallest difference that will make you the biggest, or the smallest detail that makes the biggest difference, that propels you from being good to being really great. It's little details under message delivery and nonverbal, like not looking at the screen every time you need to change slides, or making sure that you're organized enough to have an attention-grabbing opening, or videoing yourself and being aware if you have any favorite words or fillers, or simply just not saying so much. Connecting with your audience through that natural eye contact, that breaking the room into quadrants, natural gestures. I encourage you to select one aspect of your message, your delivery, and your nonverbal prowess, and commit to it with a laser-like purpose, and determine to bring your A game to your next presentation. As you're thinking about some immediate actionable ideas you know you can implement very quickly, I do want to give us some time for Q&A. So I'm going to turn the presentation back over to Sarah, and she's going to field any questions you may have. Sarah, it's all yours.
Thank you for the wonderful session, Mandy. Attendees, Q&A has begun. If you have any questions, please post the questions in Q&A panel or send me the questions via chat. You could also message me to unmute your line so that you can speak to Mandy directly.
Sarah, does it look like we have any questions?
Not yet, Mandy. I do not see any questions here. Let's give them another 10 seconds.
Okay, and then if there are no more questions in 10 seconds, then I'll be happy to close with our big bang today.
Sure.
Sarah, it doesn't appear that anyone has any questions for us today.
Yes, Mandy, I do not see any questions coming in, and I believe we can conclude today's session.
Great. To wrap things up, we've talked about message, delivery, and nonverbal know-how. Ultimately, though, whether you're meeting with 2 people in an informal conference room or 2,000 people in an association audience, you want to remember the 4 B's of being a better presenter. The 4 B's. Be prepared. Be interesting. Be brief. And then be seated. Thanks very much, everyone.